Excellent, thank you. Thanks. Yeah, so I've been influenced and working together with Susanne Cook-Reuter, and she was kind enough to share a lot of data which made this project possible. And I've also spent most of my career modeling brains and minds and consciousness. So I consider myself a dual AI/cognitive scientist. And the lens that I'm bringing to adult development in particular is the lens of leadership. There's many ways to cut it, as Nick just mentioned, there's many frameworks. I'm interested in the leadership angle because we desperately need some better leadership, as many of you on this call know better than I do. So we are failing the sustainable development goals as the human race, and there is climate change and lots of geopolitical tensions, and also in business, a lot of leadership-related challenges, volatility, uncertainty, complexity, and ambiguity, for example, which most leaders aren't equipped to handle. And part of the issue is one of epistemology and meaning making, being able to navigate nonlinearity and complexity in such a way that's effective in the world. And of course, there are different approaches to this. I'm particularly appreciative of the constructive developmental and the meaning making lens on things. So we have heard impressive presentations in the other frameworks, and the cognitive complexity is a huge one in the community. One of the reasons that I'm appreciative of the ego development / constructivist approaches is that we have some amount of evidence that complex cognition and complex meaning making on its own may not be sufficient for good leadership. It's definitely necessary. It's difficult to lead complex systems without cognitive complexity, but it may not be sufficient. So a few examples of this are the dark triad. There's anecdata about sociopathic CEOs and C-level executives, but there's also decent data that some aspects of the dark triad actually don't negatively and even slightly positively correlate with high cognitive capacity. So you might have somebody with high cognitive emotional intelligence, so the cognitive aspect of EQ, who actually uses their emotional intelligence to self-aggrandize and selfishly advance their own objectives rather than being a good servant leader. So in this study by Wyatt and others, we had a 0.3 correlation, almost highly statistically significant, between narcissism and cognitive EQ. And there is even stronger evidence from the fluid intelligence and crystallized intelligence literature, which inconsistently correlates with traits that are vital. So I just pulled out one example, conscientiousness. This is a massive meta-study by Nicolau, over 90,000 individuals, and we see that there's a slight negative correlation with conscientiousness and crystallized intelligence. So, we get people who are smart and a little bit lazy because they can afford to be. And if we include fluid intelligence and other aspects, the correlation just vanishes and becomes non-significant. So I'm aware that cognitive ability isn't quite the same thing as cognitive complexity, but there is some amount of indicative evidence to imply that for good leadership we need more than just cognition. And the presentation we heard earlier backs this up by Michael and Iris. And so the approach that I have the most data from is based on sentence completion tests. So this is the Lovinger and the Cook-Reuter tradition of ego development theory, which basically looked at many thousands of how people complete sentence stems, such as I am, or a good boss, or raising a family, and they're given an open choice what words to complete that sentence with. And it turns out that the completions kind of show a pattern. So there are these clusters of how people construct who they think they are, and how their epistemology works, and how they make meaning of their life and their experiences. And those clusters of meaning making can be called stages. There isn't really an implication here of linearity, so it is a non-linear and complex process, but it tends to be the case that most people go through these stages sequentially. So it seems to be extremely difficult and rare to skip categories of meaning making or stages of meaning making. They're, for the most part, sequential. And so, in addition to increasing cognitive complexity, or more precisely capacity for increased complexity, we also have other aspects of meaning making, such as who do I conceptualize myself to be, and what do I operate out of? What is my operating system, so to speak? I just put out two examples on the bottom here. So if I'm a stage 3, a diplomat, and I construct myself and my worldview around relationships, I might be really great and raising a family, for example, but in leadership it might be a little bit challenging because I tend not to want to rock the boat. I tend to really want to make everybody happy. And the larger my team is, the harder time I will have of making decisions that make everybody happy. As stage 3-4 expert, I have a different challenge. I conceptualize myself and my worldview through skills and expertise and what I know and what I can do, which can be great as an individual contributor, but I can be a little bit brittle to negative feedback because who I've conceptualized myself to be is heavily dependent on what I know and my skills. If somebody criticizes those skills, that can be very challenging and even threatening to my worldview. And so it's quite important, beyond just the complexity, it's quite important for leaders to look at some of these aspects so that they can navigate how they see the world and also, equally importantly, how the people that they lead see the world and how they should communicate skillfully to account for that. So as I mentioned, it's not necessarily linear. So Cook-Reuter has shown a lot of evidence that the attachment to a strong ego and a strong drive to achieve and a strong attachment to complexity tends to decrease in later stages of ego development. So people tend to deconstruct in some sense and see through the constructed nature of who they think they are and how they think the world works, which actually can be pretty powerful because they're less attached to their point of view and their constructs at later stages. Having said that, there does seem to be a transition from... I see a hand up. Julian, would you be okay with just asking questions at the end? So a general movement from linearity to systematicity and nonlinear thinking, from either or, either I'm right or you are right, to kind of both and synthesis of points of view, of course perspective taking, multiple points of view, and a kind of longer term, more world-centric thinking rather than a short-term egocentric way of operating at the later stages. So the question that I asked, based on all this data, it's like over half a century now, Lovinger has tens of thousands, and Cook-Reuter significantly extended it through her beautiful work on the late stages. So can we look at, if our bodies grow in three-dimensional physical space, can we look at what the dimensions of the psychological space might be in which our meaning-making unfolds? In other words, what are the aspects of the psyche which are relevant to adult development? Wisdom might be one of them, as we heard in the previous presentation. What are some others? And so I'll keep this presentation mostly non-technical, but very briefly just giving you an overview of the technology involved. So we have large language models, of course, things like ChatGPT. We do not use ChatGPT. We had to train a completely new model because the current models are just not very good at distinguishing structure versus content. So they overfit to what people say, and if they quote a canned piece of wisdom or they just quote a piece of somebody else's wisdom, then they might be conflated with somebody who is actually wise, versus ego development theory is interested in the structure of their meaning making. So we train a custom model based on the over 80,000 sentence completions from Lovinger and Cook-Reuter, and of course a couple of million psychology papers as well to keep up to date with scientific state of the art. Then we have computational linguistics and cognitive complexity. These are two different ways to get at how complex somebody's meaning-making structure might be in their language and in the information that they keep track of and how they structure that information. Is it many elements? Do they have long-range dependencies? Can they construct hierarchies or more complex structures? And the fourth one is the thing we call maturity indicators. So we took an approach called genetic algorithms. So it's an evolutionary approach inspired by nature to discover from the data by evolving aspects of meaning making that seem to fit the data well, rather than starting from theory, starting from what explains the data. And that turned out to be the most powerful predictor of stage in Cook-Reuter's theory. And luckily for us, powerful enough to match human expert accuracy approximately. So you see these black bars, these are various bodies of work evaluating human inter-rater reliability. So how accurate are humans compared to the theory developers when they are trained. By Lovinger, for example, we have 0.79 to 0.85 inter-rater reliability. We have Cook-Reuter at 84 in her thesis. This is significantly higher now in her practical work. We have Torbert and others in the 70s. They also claim higher numbers in their recent work. And the AI achieves about 86%. And this is a figure that we've also been able to validate externally. So we're cooperating with Harvard, Dr. Sarah Lazar, who has done an independent study and has validated our correlation figures. And we've also run a non-weird, so non-Western, educated, industrialized, rich and democratic cohort in South Africa with Dr. Pampalis, on which we also found the same accuracy numbers. This is pretty promising, but what's more exciting to me than the raw accuracy is the real-world relevance to some of these dimensions. So these dimensions of meaning-making are not just predictive of stage in one theory. They actually strongly correlate with real-world psychometrics. So I won't have time to go through all of these, but in the table on the right, you can see our construct validity numbers, and we have gathered gold standard psychometrics of a large number of constructs that pre-existed that roughly correspond to what our AI discovered here. For example, we have self-transcendence on the top. There seems to be a meta-awareness related ability to step back and look at one's own constructs, in addition to, as opposed to being fused to my emotions or who I think I am or what I think is important to me, stepping back and looking at it, kind of witness consciousness, if you will. There's a mindful meta-awareness metric by Hanley and others in 2020, and we have pretty strong correlation with it, 0.4. Even more excitingly, holistic thinking, which is kind of like a perspective taking and nuanced thinking and a both and perspective, correlates very, very strongly with 360 reviews from the leadership field. So if I look at assessments such as the leadership practices inventory or the multi-factor leadership questionnaire, and I just put leaders into percentiles of those. Is this an outstanding 90th percentile leader based on the 360 from their team? That percentile is strongly predicted by this maturity indicator called holistic thinking. So there's pretty good correlations with these external validity measures. And in addition, of course, we also have incremental validity. So these aspects of meaning making aren't equivalent to ego development stage. They say something more. They unpack the psychograph, if you will, the nuances of these aspects of the meaning making of the individual, not just their stage. And one thing that I also found neat is that the manifold, if you just take the raw data and you just plot it in these dimensions of meaning making, you get the exact same curve that Cook-Reuter published in the 90s already. So she hypothesized that human meaning making proceeds from constructing strong and beautiful and complex theories of oneself and the world, and then proceeding to see through and attach less and less to those constructs back to the ground of being. And that inverted U actually drops out of the data manifold. So at the top left, you see this arc. This is unsupervised. It's just the shape of the data itself. So before I wrap up, I just briefly want to share with you some of the data that we have seen based on this AI on some real-world leader cohorts. So this is data that's under review currently. It's about 150 leaders that we applied this model on. And interestingly, we can actually predict things like EQI. So with less than 16% mean absolute error, we can actually predict the leader's emotional intelligence quotient. Less surprisingly, we can predict the GRE scores. You know, GRE verbal, this is pretty closely related to language complexity. It's not very surprising. And as I mentioned before, we can predict the leadership practices inventory and the multi-factor leadership questionnaire with pretty high accuracy as well. The other thing we can predict, which might be relevant, is how successful will this leader be, based on things like promotion rate and salary growth. And just like Keegan showed in the early 2000s, you see this graph on the bottom, this is from the Keegan lab, executives at post-conventional stages do tend to be more effective and be promoted more and have higher ratings from their teams. So the very final piece, and I have to be quick because I have only 2 minutes left here. These maturity indicators also allow us to do some causal modeling. So they allow what-if analysis. You know, what if we actually really leaned into supporting a coachee or a leader in their holistic thinking, helping them perspective take and hold the both and of the paradox? Or what if we ran a mindfulness program, such as Iris just mentioned, and teach them how to watch their mind and be mindful? Or what if we ask them to learn analytical reasoning and systems thinking, and how can we predict the causal effects of some of those interventions? And so we use Bayesian network structure learning and debiased machine learning, so techniques that are pretty prevalent in observational studies, such as epidemiology, where looking at outcomes data, where the data might be a little bit scarce, and we found some interesting results. So I'll just show you two of these because I'm almost out of time. For the transition between conventional and post-conventional stages. So I stop being so attached to my own models and success, and I start being more inclusive of other people's perspectives. Relational maturity seems to be by far the strongest driver. So you see the average treatment of exercises here. Of course, it is on a population level, so it's not guaranteed for an individual. But on the population level, relational maturity is really catalytic for this transition. Probably because it supports perspective taking and holding the both end. Conversely, when I want to upgrade my meaning making from this kind of green meme of everybody's right, everybody's equal, I can perspective take, but I have this view that all truth is constructed and no truth is better than the other, to a kind of more nuanced view of, well, there are systems and meta-systems, and some theories do explain reality a little bit better than others. I need to lean more into analytical reasoning and systems thinking. So that's one step beyond the individual's pluralist stage, and reasoning, analytical systems thinking skills are catalytic at this stage. And at later stages, meditation or other kind of meta-awareness exercises are really catalytic to see that what I think I am and my worldview tends to be constructed, and I don't need to attach to it so much. So finally, to wrap up, this is the research. I also recently started a company with Susan Cook-Reuter and some others, and we do have a beta pilot of giving reports to coaches and looking at if the reports are helpful. So we surface these maturity indicators, we surface these catalytic aspects of meaning making, and we have tailored coaching comments that are intended to support coaches' growth. And so if any of you are interested in trialing this or in doing some collaborative research, I would love to work with you. Thank you so much for your attention. Yeah, it's an interesting question. Thanks, Nick. I think one thing I will say is a cautionary note. So in my view, these technologies should augment and never replace humans. And one aspect in particular is human attunement. So however brilliant the coaching comments are and the insights of the catalytic aspects, without the attunement of a human heart, it's significantly less powerful. And so I would see these things as tools to support coaches, not to replace them. Having said that, it is an exciting journey ahead. And I could envision something where an executive coach, in between sessions, where the coachee now would be left to their own devices, could have a kind of AI in-between coach, that can keep them on track, support them with practices, and then the attuned human coach with the human heart comes back to support, but isn't 24/7 available like the machine. So those two advantages, one would be 24/7 availability, and the other would be, of course, simulation-based insights that may not be feasible for the human coach. So very fine-grained aspects of looking into what could really support this individual. Those two together would be, from my perspective, powerful features for the future. Yeah. I think that's exactly right. And just to briefly address that, it's true. So the 2D thing is like squeezing down a very high dimensional construct, and the way your shadow on the wall doesn't capture every nuance in your face, this plot doesn't capture every nuance of meaning making. And the idea would be to really train coaches to both understand the vertical mindset, including the ethical nuance, the attunement, and that vertical higher is not always better, right? Not everybody needs to grow. Some people need integration support. Some people just stage crashed because of stress or trauma, and they need support that way. So all of these nuances of like how to support coachees need to be imparted. Having said that, I do think this framework makes it significantly easier for coaches to work with coaches. And so our vision would be the both end, right? To empower and support coaches to work with clients and to bring the beautiful attunement and their skills together with some of the tech and some of the surfaced catalytic factors so that human heart and the technological insight can coexist. And we are starting, we are piloting this. Don't know if that answers your question.